Well, thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome again Ben Marcus to campus. He had honestly one of my favorite readings last night.
Not your favorite, though.
No, actually, it was.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
It was.
I'm glad to be up in that list of the top 20.
Charles Baxter was another one of my favorite readings.
Which were some that you didn't like?
Huh?
Which were some that you didn't like?
Oh man, I like this.
Well, I don't know. You started the ranking.
I want to talk about
this. Okay, least favorite reading ever.
Least favorite reading ever.
I'm going to ask the questions
today. I hate. There was a reading, man. It was like an hour and 15 minutes long, just a reading. I tend not to.
There's that thing, right? People read forever, and you're going to die, and you peed your pants already, and they look at their watch as if to be aware of the time and ask if they should keep going.
I have.
Has anyone ever said, no, I think we've heard enough? Has anyone ever told the truth when someone asks that question?
Oh yeah, you do that by getting up and leaving.
Yeah. That should I keep going?
My least favorite reading ever, and I'm not being diplomatic here because I can't remember the poet's name, but he kept saying, I have one more poem or two more poems, and he kept reading more poems.
Yeah.
And it kind of started annoying everyone, and then people started getting up, and he yelled at them for getting up and leaving. Yeah.
What did you say? Like, how dare you?
That actually, I like that part. The bar is pretty low to do well at a reading. It's just to not read too long, and people just worship you.
Well, Amy Tan read for 5 minutes, and then spent the rest of the time answering questions, and she was great at it. And honestly, I think the way you did it was perfect. I mean, that's a perfect.
Q&A is kind of more fun for people, I think, than listening.
Well, some people's Q&A,
yeah. Yeah, right.
Like yours was okay.
Top 20, top 30?
At least top 15.
Okay.
No, it was great. I think, the thing that and by the way, this is a conversation, so at any point, if you have something on your mind, please interrupt me and ask away, okay? But one of the things that I wrote down from what you said last night was making things worse. The story that you wrote, and you felt compelled in that story, and I get a sense in a lot of your stories to make things worse.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what is compelling and important and meaningful about making things worse?
It's a good question. I guess to me it connects to the bigger question anytime I'm writing anything of what comes next and why. You're one sentence in. What is the next sentence, and what's the sort of operating procedure behind it? And in general, hopefully there's something more intuitive going on, and you're not actually systematizing it at the time. But yeah. I think about that a lot when I read. Of what draws me in, what makes me want to continue, what makes me feel like, oh, I already know everything I need to know here. I'm out. And so I suppose that story seemed to reveal a kind of possibility, because I guess I felt that it had to progress somehow.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's just really a larger description of what plot is at all. But it seemed that I found it felt energetic if things, in some very subtle way, weren't what they seemed. If it looks like it's one thing and then something shifts a little and you have to recalibrate your sense of what's actually going on, and that shifting was about an escalation, maybe either emotionally or in the story itself. And I guess I do, after the fact, think of escalation, like what is it to take what's there and to turn it or invert it or grow it so that it feels like change. Because I guess when I think about how I read and what makes me feel captured by what I'm reading, is usually there's some form of escalation.
Yeah.
There's this feeling that things are possibly worsening in an emotional or a dramatic way, because it's not easy to think of the reverse where things keep getting better.
Well, yeah,
right.
That's,
I mean,
that's what
literary
I was
fiction,
about, yeah.
maybe for better or worse, does seem like it's fairly kind of comfortable revealing things that are more tense, more fraught, more difficult, more dramatic.
Well, I don't know if you read that great George Saunders essay about the school, Donald Barthelme's The School, and he talks about escalation.
I haven't.
You know, he talks about
But I love that story.
Freytag's triangle,
Yeah.
and the dramatic, kind of structure of most plays, that it escalates.
Yeah,
And use
yeah.
that word a lot.
Yeah.
And not just escalates, but it keeps escalating on different planes.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. But what I found, what you said was interesting, was that is that this is an escalation towards things that makes characters and readers uncomfortable. And I
Yeah.
thought that was particularly interesting, because what is it about that discomfort that is true escalation and not, like you say, making things better?
Well, it's a tricky question, because I don't think you can just, as an aesthetic, invite calamity and have anything that's particularly interesting.
Yeah.
You know, you could, if that was really the criteria, you could just introduce all your characters, bring them into the room, and then kill them. And so I suppose it's some kind of softer, more complex, more enduring version of that. And it's one dramatic possibility.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's one I've been attracted to. But I will say I end up very suspicious of it as well. And I think, oh, well, this can become programmatic and a little bit rote too. Or this can just be so grim that it's just kind of almost unbearable. And
Well,
I
you
think
mentioned-
I push towards that sometimes to see what that is. And sometimes I've written things I just think they don't work, because they seem almost too programmatically dark.
Well, you talked about you were becoming wary of being strange just for strange sake.
Yes.
Is that part of that?
Definitely. I mean, I think I noticed that I just had certain habits that would arise. Well, there's a story from that book, Leaving the Sea, called Rolling Wood, and it's about a guy he's sort of a single dad taking care of his son who's sick with this sort of slightly unnamed ailment. And
He's just described in a machine at the beginning of the story, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so there were little pieces in that story that I put in that later got taken out. He gets to work and he puts his kid in the daycare, and they're sitting on a hill having lunch, and I have this kind of strange thing fly over, and it sort of seems like it's a plane, but it's sort of square, and it makes this strange noise, and it's a completely like background detail. And my editor at the time just cut it out, and I felt really vulnerable. I was like, no, you've taken away like the jewelry that like makes this whole thing worthwhile, because I had written what was essentially just a domestic story, and I really thought I needed these kind of glittery oddities that were going to somehow appease something in me. And it was an interesting, I think, good process to just say, no, fuck it, take that stuff out, because it's like a, in that case, it was a sort of crutch. It was a red herring. It was never going to get revealed in any dramatic way. I don't know though. And I feel torn about it. You know the filmmaker Alan Rudolph?
I don't.
I'm gonna blank on his film names. Film
Anyone?
people in the
Alan
room.
Rudolph?
Alan Rudolph.
Obscure.
I've made him up. Doesn't exist. I already created a fake Wikipedia page too, so don't feel like you can bust me on that. Anyway, like he did, I remember I kind of was influenced by some of the things he would do. Like regardless of what the storyline was in his movies, like in the background a car would go by and it would just be like a car you'd never seen before. And it wasn't futuristic and it wasn't antiquated. It was just like, what the fuck was that? And I realized that I was very responsive to atmospherics, background details, the sorts of things that, and I guess in the way I think about it now is like, I think when I read or when I look at something, I think I really like to feel unsettled. It's a bland term for it, but something that maybe reminds you that you don't actually know everything, that you can't take this whole place, this whole space for granted, that maybe the laws of physics aren't quite exactly the same. Now the danger when these things get too heavily presented is that I think there can be a loss of gravity, at least.
So
in
is
writing.
it about presentation then, or I mean, what made you end up agreeing with your editor on that point?
I think to try it, because I thought, I've spent probably 20 years of writing insisting on this. I've done it, and so the vulnerability of it felt good. I suppose I like to feel vulnerable with what I've written, like that it's maybe unprotected or naked in some way. And I thought, well, if this is a really important maneuver for me, I'll just do it in the next story.
Yeah,
it was really a minor cut, actually. I mean, it was like 2 lines.
Yeah.
And there were a couple other things like that, and they all kind of came out. And the argument was, well, these are distractions. There's like little fireworks in the distance, but there's actually quite a lot dramatic going on here, and it's enough.
Well, I guess I'm always curious, and I have a sense my students are too, about the separation between what you want as a writer in your work, which sounds kind of silly to people who don't write. It's like the difference between what you want and what the story wants or needs. And it's hard to kind of understand the separation there. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I mean, I feel, though, that that whole the personification of the story, and you hear people saying, like, my characters just spoke to me and all of that. Like, I've always felt quite estranged from that experience. I mean, maybe that really happens for people. And I like the way it sounds. But even when it comes to what I think I want, that's a pretty unstable place too, because I feel like I can talk myself into various possibilities for something.
But your previous point about when people say characters kind of act on their own, I think what people mean when they say that, or at least what I mean sometimes when I say that, is that there's a difference between pre-planning and kind of forcing characters to act a certain way, and then just kind of finding it word by word what they say. But it becomes that kind of like,
there's a lot of really like
silly kind of magical way of saying,
highly romantic ways that lots of writers, I mean, it's a funny thing because writers are asked to look back and create a narrative out of something that they really don't understand and don't really need to understand. It's like understanding it has very little bearing on doing it again, I think, for me anyway. I mean, but one is often asked to kind of go back into a story like moment by moment, as if you're this sort of architect with a set of tools, like making all these really deliberate choices. And maybe some people write that way, but I often feel that essentially I tell a lot of small lies when I have to kind of recount how something came about. And I don't want to lie. I mean, I enjoy lying a little bit, but it's sort of it's a difficult thing. I mean, I don't know. It's like somebody hits a home run and then they're asked to say, so how'd you do that? And they can sort of say, well, I swung at the right time.
And they end up saying some variation of that.
Not to equate story writing with the hitting of a home run, because it's clear that it's not nearly as important. Writing baseball, but all of these, I mean, and also we teach, so we're always having to have these kinds of discussions about how this all happens. They're quite difficult. It doesn't mean I think we shouldn't be doing it. But I don't know. I mean, do you feel that you're getting at something kind of accurate when if you're asked to go back and describe how you wrote something?
I always feel like I'm like connecting the dots after the fact. And absolutely. I mean, because it's just quite boring to just say, well, it just kind of worked that way,
just happened.
And I just got lucky if that worked out okay for readers.
Right.
Yeah.
It didn't suck, so I kept it in there. Yeah. But that's sort of
Well, as you know, I think and this might be a larger discussion about the difference between taking an English class and taking a creative writing class, but I sense I've always thought of English classes as looking at things as like an anthropologist or an archaeologist, as an artifact that has, like automatic value. Yeah. And, well, I don't want to digress too much, but it seems to me that with, when you study English, sometimes there's a sense that the writer always intended things. Students will always think of it that way. And I think most writers would say, well, a lot of the stuff that is of value we didn't intend. you know, or at least we didn't intend it the way people think we do. Do you
Yeah.
feel the same way about your writing?
I mean,
Especially,
I think that there's a ton of intention there. It's just that while you're doing it, you are really not required to have a kind of ancillary conversation about it. You really,
Yeah.
all your energy is going into the doing of it. And I suppose if one way I think about it is I'm writing something that first and foremost I need to really want to read. I need to really crave this. I'm writing this for myself,
yeah,
and I'm a specific kind of reader with whatever my, you know, my faults are. But I'm literally going to have to read it 1,000 times while working on it or more. And I'm writing it word by word. And in some sense, I'm doing it to produce a bunch of sensations in myself.
yeah,
And if it's just making me feel more dead than I already feel, then I'm not going to keep doing it. I just have no interest in doing it, and the world doesn't want it. It's not like the world is demanding this product and we can put our own feelings aside and just keep pumping it out because nobody cares. So in some sense, I think, you know, I think back to like my first experiences as a reader and just being transported and wrecked and disturbed, and, you know, like coming out of my room and looking at my parents and just feeling like everything had changed. For whatever I was reading, God the fuck knows what it was.
yeah.
But just feeling so immersed and so kind of corrupted and kind of romanced and everything. And I think in some sense, in some really naive way, I really am looking just to recreate those feelings. They're really hard to get. They're hard to get back.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel this kind of withdrawal from feeling that way. I just, and so in some sense, a story is a very, very selfish thing of just sitting down and very selfishly trying to create a bunch of feelings
back to
for
that
myself
place.
in my
Yeah.
in my room. And then I guess, you know, you hope that there are some other people wired slightly similar to you who will sit down and read it and feel similar things.
I mean, I think most people here would, and, you know, if they're a writer, I think they would say that they're kind of pursuing the same thing. There are questions I want to. Okay, there's one.
You said that you yesterday that you stumbled into a place or something that kind of when you write. Do you ever feel like you go to a physical place and walk around and just try to describe actually what you see? Is that like the process?
You know, it's really not. I feel actually like if I'm doing that, like let's say just kind of doing a tally of a landscape or describing what a room is like, that, like to me there are a lot of really dead pockets in fiction of just like spending a page describing what a character looks like, or like an inventory of this fictional space. And I often find, at least in my hands, that has no dramatic pressure. And so you know, and there are a lot of things I do that I have to do, and then I look back at them and I just delete all of them. And like one of the things I do all the time that is just horrible, makes me really depressed, is I kind of over proceduralize character movement. You know, instead of saying like he left the room and went to work, well, you don't even really need he left the room, because he went to work. But I would write 5 pages because I would feel this weird responsibility to account for the movement of this body out of a chair. It's like he grabbed both sides of the chair, leaned forward, and it's something like I know better. I know not to do this, and yet I do it all the time. I mean, I could publish a 1,000-page book of procedural physical description. It would kill like an entire population of people if they had to read it. I mean, I don't know. I think I've sort of dodged a little bit past your question of just like how if I encounter a fictional space, but like I think that describing like what I see is really very often deadly to me. Like it very often will take me away from like what I feel needs to be happening next. Like, you know, you put a character in a car and they're going somewhere, and you read this kind of thing all the time. Someone might just take a page to describe what they see out the window. And this is the kind of thing in a movie that you don't even really mind. It's just like, what's out there? Oh, look at that. There's some hills. and lots of writers will really write that very nicely. I suppose, and I'm not even feeling critical about it, because I think these are the kinds of gestures that other writers very innately come to, and they can extract drama from it. But to me, I feel almost cynical about it in advance, and I just think if I do that, it's going to be really hollow, and it's not gonna matter at all.
Yeah, my friend Chris has a whole spiel about the syndrome you're talking about the procedural stuff, and I do too. And his theory is that we think in movies now. That's our problem. Because
Yeah.
that's
You,
in
yeah.
the 19th century, people thought in verse, and then in the 20th century, they thought in terms of motivation and things like that.
But that procedural narrative stuff was worse even back then. I mean, I think, in fact, movies have made people maybe slightly more alert.
So it's the visual aspect.
Yeah.
Like you're always
Yeah.
trying to describe things visually, and with people, especially young writers, I see this in my students' stories all the time. They're trying to replicate the experience of seeing a movie
Yeah.
using prose, and that's a big mistake. 'Cause you can't win.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I always try to think, well, what is language good at that the other mediums are not good at, or not as good at? And then if physical motion needs to kind of happen, we also, knowing that you can trust somebody's imagination, right? Like, you don't have to describe a character's face for people to think they know what a character looks like. There's a lot of,
They're gonna put their
yeah,
ex-boyfriend or
yeah,
whatever in that place.
yeah,
The cartoonist Linda Berry has a really good anecdote about this. She said you can just say he went into the supermarket.
yeah,
You don't have to say he walked into a wide oblong box. On one side there were
Yeah.
rows of tomato soup, 12 deep and 50 deep.
Yeah.
You don't have to just say
yeah,
the grocery store, and people provide the grocery store for you.
yeah.
And this is the way to get around that.
So much fiction, though, is really obsessed with that kind of itinerizing and just documenting and just adding the data. Two characters in a room having an argument in the kitchen. Let's spend 5 pages learning about when they bought the house. Right, all like backstory. Just the impulse towards backstory. Just what is it? And so often a writer might think, well, I'm satisfying a sort of a curiosity, but it's funny when you strip a lot of that away and see what's left.
But how much of that impulse to describe, or to, you said the procedural description, how much of that is the importance of language to you? Because when you are describing those kinds of procedural things, you seem to always be trying to do it in a language that is different from what we're expecting.
Yeah, I guess to me, though, like, I don't know what anyone's expecting. Like, to me, if I'm writing something, I don't ever think, well, here I'm going to sort of phrase this in a way no one's ever heard before. I suppose, like, to me, this topic is about knowing when something is going to kind of kill the momentum in a story, and having the sort of courage to avoid it, to stay on the ride, so that there's something that feels really propulsive, and to me almost sort of terrifying and really hurtling along. It's also only one kind of model, because there's a lot of what I would call really pretty inert fiction that I find really compelling and really, really interesting.
Yeah, so you talk a lot about propulsion and kind of getting from one word to the next, or sentence to the
Yeah.
next, or incident worsening,
Yeah.
escalating. What's the end point? Like, how do you cope with resolution? At what point
Yeah.
do you rein in the worsening, and how and why?
I don't know, really. I think it is a really good question. I think sometimes I feel I get into a space where some slowness suddenly seems actually like a really good idea. Because I think the umbrella term over all of it, it's not propulsion or momentum so much as change. And this gets back to something I end up talking about a lot with students. If we're looking at a piece of writing and wondering why it's so bad. We're like, what is it that's making this feel so inert and stuck and all of this? And one question we end up asking a lot is like, what would change look like in this story? Because change, in just really an abstract way, just makes you feel kind of good, like something is suddenly different. And I think when you don't feel it and you don't feel that change is even possible, I think it sort of kills the spirit a little when you're reading. It's sort of hard to know why you would continue unless you were being paid to keep reading it, read it all the way to the end. But then the question is, yeah, what does an ending look like? And I suppose, again, it's not to kind of cop out on all this, but it's something a little more intuitive if a set of emotional conditions come into play that you can work with a little more slowly. And hopefully where you are on page 15 is going to feel emotionally really different from where you were on page 3. So you suddenly have other feelings in play that you're using. It isn't simply just an exercise in how to advance time, but it's also how to grow feeling. But endings are, I don't know, my wife, Heidi Julovitz, has a book out right now, and I had to interview her about it.
Oh, that's interesting.
I wanted to. I won this lottery, and I got invited to the interview center to interview her. And it's a book that's sort of written as a diary, and someone was asking her actually about all the endings, because there are these really sharp endings to all the entries, and she just said, I kept thinking I had to stick the landing. And obviously it's a metaphor, and who knows how helpful it really is, but it speaks a little bit to that feeling, right? Like how do you know when you're done? And there's just, you're working towards that feeling you'd like to have when you finish a story. But it does seem to involve some violation of propulsion at a certain point, right? You're actually saying the rules I was following now have to get upended and reversed. And I am also interested in that, in the reversal of rules and the reversals, just reversals in general, because that also seems to kind of become a kind of change.
So how do you address the kind of, now at this point very conventional mode of conclusion and resolution, which is the epiphany? I mean, like to your students, how do you, because I feel like that's the first and most important thing that we learn when we start writing, which is at some point we need to have a change in the character, and this comes often.
Did you learn? Were you taught that?
I wasn't.
Yeah, no one ever taught me that either.
No.
I was taught that I was taught it, Like,
You were taught
Right.
what?
We think we learned that.
There's an essay about this against epiphanies.
Yeah.
We're all sort of taught that we were taught
Yeah.
to expect epiphanies.
Right.
But there's resistance to it now, and I was just curious what
I
your
sometimes
thoughts on
think
that
if
were.
only my students could pull off an epiphany. At least there'd be that to work with. I do love my students, I'm sorry. I'm in another city, I'm far away, I feel like I can throw them under the bus.
We won't do anything but put it on Facebook, so.
Actually, this morning I was teaching the story Car Crash while hitchhiking.
Oh, yeah.
Dennis Johnson, in my nonfiction workshop, because when Dennis Johnson was here, he said that story's totally true. It's nonfiction.
Yeah.
Make it up. So, but we talked about the ending, where for those of you who haven't read it, in the last sentence, the narrator says, you ridiculous people, you expect something out of me?
Yeah.
He's just saying,
Yeah.
there's no lesson to be learned.
But see, interestingly, that it functions, it's like a kind of default epiphany, because suddenly you have audience address, it violates this rule, you haven't really, is it in that story yet?
No.
Right. So he's breaking a formal rule, and I don't know, when I read that story, it's like epiphanic to hit that moment. His latest short story, which is called something Sea Maiden, it was in the New Yorker like a year ago. No, it's not. It's a standalone short story, but it opens with it's pretty good, but kind of something you've seen before. It's like dinner party and kind of adults fighting quietly and seething, but it does a similar move. Like right at the end of this first section, which is like a page or two long, it does a kind of direct address, and it just says, it takes all the characters and does this little sort of future cast and says, these two would divorce, these two, one would die, and everyone is kind of buried and put away, and then the line before the break is, but you and I know what goes on. And it kind of brings you in, makes you complicit in this huge assessment, and then those characters are gone. They never return in the story, and you're already just destroyed, and you've totally become his creature. He can do whatever he wants. He's broken the rules and ironically, earned all your trust, and it's just amazing. Yeah.
Well,
He's incredible.
the other convention I've noticed in contemporary fiction, especially with short stories, is that in place of the epiphany, you get the epiphanic image, a very kind
Yeah.
of suddenly lyrical,
Yeah.
moving image
Yeah.
usually, to kind of, I guess, illustrate the epiphany that the character is not articulating.
It'd be cool to see a whole kind of chart of all the different strategies that people use and kind of get them classified out like that,
Yeah,
And one
it
thing
would
I
be.
notice I do a lot that I think is indefensible too is I tend to create really, really pretty despicable characters. At least if you're one of those people who care. I don't like. To me, like the character likability issue is kind of laughable. But then I seem to think that if it's gone way too far and they're so kind of horrible, either self-loathing or the stuff they're doing to others, or really just, let's say, the stuff they're thinking, that they're kind of beyond any repair, then a kind of half-assed redemptive gesture seems always like a good idea to me, because redemption is usually so treacherous and so kind of sentimental and such a weird tar pit of awful everything. But if it can't work, then suddenly that redemption becomes possibly poignant and interesting. And I notice after the fact, I'm always faking redemption when it's just totally not on the table.
Well, that seems to be the case with the Moors, the last story in Leaving
Yeah,
the
that's
Sea.
that's.
But
a
I think
good
that
example.
works, and I'm trying to figure out why.
You're saying it is redemptive?
No, yeah, it is, I think.
Well, all right.
Or at least it's a gesture at
Yeah.
redemption that might not actually be redemption, but just kind of delves a little deeper into his psyche.
Yeah.
Because
I think
I'm being vague here because I don't want to ruin it for people. It's a 50-page story about a man, kind of, I guess.
Don't give it away. It can't be ruined. It comes pre-ruined. It's a guy standing in line at work to get a coffee behind a woman he's sort of attracted to, and it's really just
Intensely attracted to.
And it's just a portrait of what goes on in his head, all of his thoughts that are really, really not pleasant.
Yeah.
And then in the end, you learn a little bit extra about his home life, which is quite a cheap trick, I think, in some sense. But suddenly you learn something that looks like it's trying to make you really rethink.
But it's not a
This
cheap
guy.
trick because you made a decision to do that.
I know if it's a cheap trick. I did it.
Yeah, you did do it. You did do it, but there was a
No.
reason why you did it. So
But, I
justify yourself. Is what I
So,
guess.
well, so I thought about this a lot. I started to convince myself in the writing of that story. So he's having really like a series of pretty much jailable thoughts about everything and about this person.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty much everything he thinks would, if he acted on any of it, he'd be put away. But I really started to think a lot about just this amazing boundary between what we think and what we do. Obviously, that's such an obvious thing, but it seemed like these weren't really crimes of any kind at all, that this was just, it was all safe because it was all just what he was thinking. And if you were to watch this, you would simply see a guy, maybe he'd be a little sweaty looking, but he would simply just be standing there. And so to me, the story after the fact looked like that tension.
I mean, that's basically what you're saying. What can writing do that other
Yes, and
interiority, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so I thought, like, okay, I'm in this story, for better or worse, that's all about kind of revealing his unpleasant thoughts. So then really, why not really go for it?
Yeah.
But then the question was, well, what is the ending? And how do you get out of that, or how do you bring it to a halt? And it had already gone on way too long, and it seemed like here's a totally unredemptive character. So redemption started to look like a safer or more interesting space because it could never work. So like failed redemption, I guess, becomes appealing to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not sure that's really that defensible, because I think it's got some problems.
Isn't there a tonal component to the resolution question as well? I mean,
Yeah,
it's not
sure.
just a question of,
Yes.
okay, you have to slow the plot
Yeah.
or reverse the
Yeah.
action so that you come to some
Yeah.
ending at some point. But if you made the character so loathsome and build it so far, so high, then it just becomes a kind of a different sort of, then it's a farce, or it becomes
Yeah.
kind of black comedy, then you cross a tonal boundary. So that requires kind of a little bit of letting up on the brake as well, I think, when
Yeah.
readers get whiplash, even if they're you.
I think that's right. I think that is really true. And how you calibrate and modulate that is kind of beyond me. Yeah, right, right. But I think about that a lot too. It would be very easy for this to turn silly.
Right.
And I just finished working on a story that really destroyed me. It was really vexing. Everything about it felt wrong from the beginning. Like it really just felt like a set of problems. And whenever I wasn't working on it, I would just get this sinking feeling that I was wasting my time and that it was doomed. And so very early on, the whole writing of this story felt like trying to tackle these impossible problems. And one of them was that the story seemed cursed by levity, cursed by a kind of failure to matter. That like whatever was being generated was just in the end dismissible and silly and light. And it just felt like I was throwing out these grappling hooks and trying to make something take on weight, trying everything I could possibly do. And so, I feel like I'm occasionally in that exact predicament of things seeming a little too silly and a little too, kind of overdone. Yeah.
How do you fix it? Or did you? Did you fix it?
I don't know, I mean, not many people have read it. I think I probably fixed a version of it, and in so doing, I created problems I don't really know about yet.
Yeah.
I imagine, right? And I think, like, the character at the beginning of this story had this kind of affliction, and I was just in my no exposition mode, which I'll occasionally really get into too, where I will give no information about anything. You're just going to watch this, and it'll all be fueled by your curiosity. But then halfway through, I'm in a real pickle because if I can't answer those questions, then it seems like a big game. But so this character had this affliction, and I think I very, very slowly sort of found this way to kind of really downplay it and then really ground it. And then it suddenly turned out like what I was using as a initial shock value to maybe just satisfy my own jaded attention span so that I would care, I had somehow, I think, found a way to reconfigure so that you're actually going to now sort of feel a little badly that this person has this affliction because of these series of things that had happened. And so suddenly I had kind of found a way to flip it a little bit. But who knows, then the new problem might just be sentimentality, right? Because you can't just like, it'd be nice if we could just say, well, I'm going to create a character and I'm going to make you really love this character. And then I'm going to slowly expose them to a lot of suffering, and you're going to cry. And boom, there's my story. But like that, too, it's problematic. So.
Yeah, we spoke about Marilyn Robinson last night. That was one thing that I do remember from...
We did? Or you?
Briefly, we mentioned Marilyn Robinson.
Did we?
In the context of...
I don't remember.
We're so hammered.
of your interview at Iowa.
The
yeah.
interview, right.
But
So we didn't talk
that
about
was
her.
No, no.
Okay, yeah.
But she loathed that. She that's why she didn't like Flannery O'Connor. She said, I don't like it when authors just
punish their
punish their characters. Yeah. Whereas I feel like I wouldn't even put it that way. I feel like I'm revealing more when I put characters in highly uncomfortable situations.
It's really difficult to just stand by quietly and hear anyone criticize Flannery O'Connor. It is.
It is hard.
I just think, I don't know what to say back to that.
We didn't either.
Yeah.
We didn't either.
I think it's good. I guess it's a provocation.
I want to go back to the idea of endings and play kind of game of spoilers and ask you other endings that you think not just are successful, but are kind of inexplicably successful. I mean, you know, whether it's an ending of a novel or a short story where you came to the end and you're still kind of figuring out, well, how did they resolve that in a way that mystifies me but satisfies me?
Oh, in other people's work?
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to ask me to refer to stuff I've read?
Just curious. I mean,
Yeah, I'm just drawing a blank because I guess I don't have like a kit bag of like favorite endings, you know.
I feel like students often talk to me about not knowing how to end stories, and we've talked about, you know, epiphanies. We've talked about, you know, various kinds of ways to resolve, and I'm never sure if there's a good answer for that.
I think that there, as with any question that matters about writing, there is no answer.
Mm-hmm.
But then the whole idea is about tackling that uncertainty and kind of approximating something. I mean, if there was an answer, then suddenly I think this whole practice would lose all kinds of value.
Well, that's true, yeah.
And that I'm not trying to just avoid it, but I just don't know that we can be that prescriptive, because you know, if you look at the Flannery O'Connor stories and how they end, you know, they're so wrenching, and they're filled with these terrible reversals and ironies. They're the kinds of endings that add so much to everything in the story if you go back and look at it again. You know, in Everything That Rises Must Converge, this guy, Julian, is a monster to his mother. Throughout the whole story, they get on a bus and the mother is racist, and it just aggravates his anger, and he, in a lot of ways, he kind of seems to get what he wants, and she collapses, has a stroke, dies, and all of his anger, so you have the justified anger of her bad behavior, her racism, then you have the slightly unjustified anger of just being the irritated son. It's all mixed together, and it's all kind of unraveled. So you have to, your whole experience of the story gets undone and remade as something else. I mean, her endings are really interesting in the way that just mechanically they seem to affect everything back into the story. They don't seem like contraptions that are attached to the end. They seem very much part of the DNA of the entire story.
Yeah.
Like something that's going to really maximize your feeling.
Well, Good Man is Hard to Find.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the best. What is the? She would be okay if there was someone there to shoot her in the face every day of her life. Every day of her life. I'm totally getting it wrong.
I wanted to ask, do you guys know the story Bullet in the Brain by Toby?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the redemptive gesture at the end, but it's really literally out of left field because it's the baseball. We're getting back to baseball again.
Yeah.
That's an
Yeah,
interesting
like weird
story.
Baseball image, you know, for those of you who don't know, the story takes place while this bullet is going through this guy's brain. He's just been shot during a bank robbery.
But he's
an art critic.
he's a critic, and he's a bastard. He's crabby, and he's like yelling at people in line, and he gets shot. And then most of the story sort of describes the bullet going through his brain. But the story does something I think is really genius before it even gets to the baseball, which is this long riff that sort of, you know, you think you're going to get this sort of end of life set of images where everything important comes back to him, and I forget how Wolf sets it up, but it's like he didn't think of, and then it lists all these super drippingly sentimental, poignant memories that he did not think of. So here the story has actually found a way to insert this portrait, and it's heart-wrenching, but it somehow escapes sentimentality because he's not thinking of it. In fact, he just feels sort of worse because these are the things that matter, and he's not thinking them. And then it gets to the ending riff where it focuses on some
guy who says second base is the best position they is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He gets.
I used to hate that story.
You hate that story?
No, I used to. My students asked me to bring a story to class that I hated. So I brought that story. And I hated it because people love it so much. It's just kind of like a knee-jerk reaction. And then I really kind of read it slowly to discuss it, and then I said, oh, fuck, I like this story.
It's so unlike his other stories,
But
too. It's so
yes,
interesting.
but you're right. It's a brilliant inversion in the middle of the story. That's
Yeah.
what makes the story, I feel, there.
Yeah. So I don't know. How do you say something smart about endings? You know, I think again it comes back to creating an experience that you want to have when you finish a story.
Well, I do want to change gears real quick because I do want to ask you about this, something I'm very curious about. Stephen Poole, who's a British journalist and author, said of your work that it is, what do you call it, a testament of personal loss. And I felt when I was reading it, not knowing much about you outside of the fact that you're married with a family, that there's so much in at least your last two books about families, about parents and children, about relationships between lovers, spouses. There's a lot of fathers in there. Now, I'm not trying to ask you about your personal life. I'm just students my students are always curious about how one negotiates the personal with one's fiction. And so I'm just very curious about how you approach that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess probably for the early years of my writing life, I think I thought that being explicitly autobiographical was just kind of not for me, that it wasn't something I was going to do well, that material didn't feel that interesting or particularly available to me. And so I was reaching much further afield, and I was often being really explicitly inventive and explicitly not, unrealistic. And I remember, probably I overheard this, kind of a nifty defense of all this, that this was all, well, it was actually emotionally autobiographical. I think I just used this phrase in an interview earlier today. He's not here.
Is he here?
Oh, sorry, he's right there. Sorry, I might have to take that back. But the question was always really sort of vexing to me. I mean, in some sense, whatever we make it's a product of us, and maybe that sounds a little facile in the same way that people say every act is political. If they're trying to justify their lack of politics, it's sort of usually that's usually where you hear that kind of phrase. But I suppose it was just a real autobiographical material just was a little kind of dead and molded and sort of unavailable to me. But at the same time, I always really wanted to create a lot of feeling and a lot of emotion in my work, and I think I was working from real emotional experiences, but feeling as though my job was to recostume them, was to kind of take real feelings and provide tableau and illustrations and enactments and theatrical spectacles that were kind of messengers and carriers for all this real feeling. Mm-hmm. But I guess I got a little exhausted with that, and I moved a little closer to maybe something that looked a little more autobiographical. I know when I had kids, I became much more in touch with just a whole new set of fears. What if anything ever happened to them? And it's sort of a terrible, but also an amazing new set of feelings you have that you can work with. But I think I was writing about families even before that, and I've written now more recently much more explicitly autobiographical stuff, but like in a lot of ways the distinction doesn't have a lot of meaning to me. Mm-hmm. I've written stories that some people who don't know me think are entirely autobiographical that really aren't at all, and then I've written autobiographically and people don't seem to notice. And so
it's
in
always
some
the
sense
least,
it's kind of like I remember when I was growing up and in writing class out on the Veld, this kind of wisdom that if it had happened to you, that your sort of literary powers would be a little dimmer, that you were going to be too close to it and not capable of turning it into anything, and so that distancing from it would help you.
Yeah.
I don't even really remember. Essentially, when I think about it now, these were a set of cautions probably issued by scared people who wanted to create some kind of manifesto around some positions that they seem to have. And my feeling really now is it's all fair game, but it still has to somehow survive that litmus for me of just being interesting and compelling.
Yeah, I mean, the question of what is autobiographical and what is not, to me, is not nearly as interesting as, it made me think of what you were saying when you said you like making yourself uncomfortable as you write.
Yeah.
And is that just another, version of that, writing about oneself and revealing things? I mean, it makes me uncomfortable,
Yeah.
so maybe I'm projecting.
No, that's
but
actually not the kind of discomfort
No.
I'm talking about. I mean, I guess I know exactly what you mean, and I suppose I can make myself uncomfortable if I'm going to suddenly kind of reveal a friend or loved one in uncompromising ways. But that to me that feels, at least for me, a little cheap and easy. And the unsettled feeling I'm thinking about is more, I don't know, it's what I get when I read Ishiguro's work, with the exception of the last novel, The Buried Giant, which I also did like, but it was just so unusual for him.
Yeah.
But in Never Let Me Go, the novel, and then there's a story he wrote called A Village After Dark, and also, of course, The Unconsoled, which I think is kind of his amazing,
I agree,
but
yeah.
pretty thorny masterpiece. There's just there's a real instability. We're really not given any context. We have to sort of just invest in a scenario and follow a character who we grow closer to, but we don't have a lot of narrative aids. We don't have sort of a helping hand to be told kind of what's really happening. Like just that larger experience of feeling disoriented, but not so much that you don't care. So it's that kind of unsettled, not unsettled because I've revealed a secret of somebody who
I see.
values his privacy.
The thing you said last night for the students who weren't there about reading in this context. So what you said was that everything you write comes from something that you've read.
Yeah,
The idea being that, I mean, in my class we talk a lot about how there's no really profoundly meaningful distinction between imagination and lived experience. Like what comes from your imagination also comes from your
Yeah.
lived experience, or it comes from books. But
Yeah.
I liked the thing you said last night about reading. And
Well,
now
yeah,
reading
so
becomes what you write.
when I was in graduate school, there was this sort of cautionary adage going around by the poet Francis Pond that we can only write what we've already read. And one way to hear that is you're just sort of doomed to kind of regurgitate everything you've read. And so if you're just reading all the popular books or the books everyone else is reading, in some sense you're maybe unwittingly confining yourself to a particular literary practice that's going to look pretty familiar. And I remember at the time thinking, okay, well, if that's true, if I'm just fated to that, then I'm going to read some things that no one else is reading. And that was sort of also, I mean, I guess there are still libraries, but I used to love to just go to the library and just really pretty randomly grab books. Because I think for a little while, and I'm kind of glad this passed, but I really just had this feeling that, well, a writer just consumes language and then sort of spits it back out. And so it kind of didn't matter. Like I didn't need it to be a great novel to think it was worth reading. And I still read like very little fiction in the end compared to nonfiction, essays.
Really?
Yeah, works of philosophy, science, and even like, and also, the other sort of dirty secret is I don't finish a lot of books because I just don't care enough. Like I only finish a book if I really have to, or if I really want to. And often, I don't know, I'll stop reading a book 3 pages from the end.
Wow.
Because I'm just like, nah. But, so I don't know, I think that as writers, we probably feel a lot of pressures about what kind of reader to be and what to read, and you feel this shame, like, oh, I haven't read D.H. Lawrence, I'm such an asshole. You sort of feel like you have these deficiencies and you've got to make them up and you never will. And a lot of it is just kind of tyrannical and sort of, I mean, obviously we should be naturally motivated to read and read and read and read, but I guess I just felt, I started to notice that I got a lot of ideas just reading, reading like a gardening book. Like just a weird way a sentence was phrased, I would just think, oh, it's so strange the way that was written, and I would just steal it.
I'm just suggesting a positive counterpoint
Yeah.
in the context of Vu's question, which is that you don't have to live an experience to imagine it and then render it in your work.
Yeah,
And so it
yeah,
doesn't
that's
matter
right.
if it's
That's
not
right.
that.
Yeah.
Because your imagination is your autobiography as well. You can take people on a tour of your mind, and whether it's factually accurate.
I totally agree. I do think, though, and I feel like I was quite exposed to this, that there's such a premium and a kind of a high currency placed on something supposedly autobiographical. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And, one's often sort of measured against this. But now, I don't know, maybe it's changed because everyone writes post-apocalyptically now. But people are finding a way to write the autobiographical post-apocalyptic book.
It's everyone.
Pretty challenging.
We should wrap up. Is there one more question that anyone? I will agree with you about the unconsoled. And that was
Yeah,
a
I love
great
that
example of like that unsettling. I remember reading, the beginning of that book when Ryder gets to the hotel
Yeah.
and goes up to the hotel with the guy who's carrying his bags, and they're having this conversation. And the conversation keeps going and going. You realize there's no way an elevator ride would last this long. And it's, Ishiguro's introduction into the unsettling nature of this world. And I just thought that was so brilliant and so kind of.
Yeah. Do you
under
know
the
the
radar.
story of Village After Dark?
No.
So it's about this. I know we have to stop. It's about this guy who he goes back to this town. It's somewhere in England, or maybe it's not even stated. And it's a place where he used to live, and you're never really told this, but there's very little he remembers. You don't know what he used to do. You come to learn that he was once very well known and well regarded in this town, and there are all these vague political kind of phrases used that, like, the movement is referred to, and he was this voice for the movement, and he goes to this house that he kind of remembers, and they know him, and they really are angry to see him, and he kind of can't, you're following him, but you're just given nothing. And so, in a way, he writes about amnesia a lot, but it's sort of not like a real kind of amnesia. And anyway, he keeps running into people who know a lot more about him than he does, and it's so overpowering. But also, the town doesn't really exactly work like a town. There's something really fucked up going on, and at some point, someone says, "Here, I'll take you to so and so. They really would love to catch up with you about the old days." And he's following this person through these streets, and the person, of course, is just getting further away. He loses sight of her. And then he's alone, and he runs into someone he went to school with as a little kid who he bullied. And at this point, you're just so kind of destroyed by everything that's happening. And reality really has stopped mattering, but there's a lot of logic. Within the unreality, there's a lot of logic at work. And he ends up being kind of taken to a bus station and told that, the buses come every 5 or 6 hours, and I know it's the middle of the night and you're tired and you really want to lie down, but there will be a bus. And then he gets these warnings about the bus might be there might be a lot of people, because people are they're revelers all ride this bus. And this description of this bus that he hasn't even gotten on, that's filled with partying people in the middle of the night in this invented English landscape. And I suppose in an English class, or if you wanted to interpret it, you think, oh yeah, he fucking died and it's the afterlife. But it's so it's just so subtle, and it is just, when I read through that, I just think, that's how I want to feel all the time. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't want to copy him too obviously. Yeah. And also, I can't write like that. I can't do what he does. But I do feel like it comes as close as it can to kind of capturing a set of feelings that I'm interested in trying to create. Then the question of how to do that is a bigger one.
Yeah, and that's the fun challenge of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah.
Can a short story which ends with a repulsive character getting his comeuppance be a superior short story if it's well written, or is it always going to be bad? I'm thinking as an example, All for Reasons of White Lies.
You know, I would never want to kind of come up with a rule saying that can't work. I just feel like what's so great is new writers all the time are inheriting these rules and barriers and just saying that they don't apply and proving otherwise. I don't know that story, though. Did it work for you? Yeah, so, you know, obviously it can. I mean, you know, it's funny when we talk about, like, well, the book publishing world and the reviewing culture, because we're often getting exposed to standards that we
Yeah.
just that completely can't relate to. So, you know, I think it's isolating even just to be a reader, because you see value systems all around getting promoted that maybe just don't resonate with your own. So, you know, there will always be people who don't want to read about anyone unpleasant.
And that might
In fact,
be the
that's
best
most readers.
that might be the best argument, to just go to the library and pick up a book that hasn't been checked out in, like, 50 years, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Just to get out of this, standard kind of, literary world sometimes.
Yes.
Anyway, we have refreshments over there. Feel free to stick around. But thank you all again
Yes,
for coming.
thank you all. Thanks.